G20 leaders put an uncomfortable spotlight on climate change at last month's Leaders Summit in Brisbane, despite efforts by host Australia to focus more narrowly on economic growth. Japan pledged $1.5 billion to the fund during the summit, and the United States President Barack Obama pledged up to $3 billion, putting the fund within sight of its $10 billion goal. In November, the United States and China set goals for curbing climate change, brightening prospects for Paris, even though their promises, including Beijing's plan for an undefined peak in greenhouse gas emissions by around 2030, were vague. With Australia's surprise donation, the Green Climate Fund has now reached a United Nations goal of $10 billion. Several of the 190 nations at the meeting welcomed the cash from both Australia and Belgium.
Germany is bringing trust and ambition to the COP in Lima, and we hope that we are ready to do the right decisions to come up to Paris next year and then be sure that we will save the world from climate change. We were the first one to spend to the Green Climate Fund, and we are giving $1 billion.
But China said rich countries were not working fast enough to meet a broader goal of providing $100 billion a year by 2020.
The objective for the 2020 is the provision of $100 billion per year by 2020. So 10 billion is just 1/10 of that objective, and yet we do not have any clear roadmap or clear picture of meeting that targets by 2020. Of course, the 10 billion is not for a year even. It applies to the initial capitalization of the GCF. So that's why I said that maybe it's far from adequate, and it would be ranging from 3 to 4 years. But so that's there's still a large gap between the 2020 targets of $100 billion per year. It's a joint announcement. Does not necessarily blur the distinction between developing countries. Actually, China and the US, as the largest developing country in the world and also the largest developed country in the world, I think they announced their actions, but that also in a differentiated manner. And for the US, it's economy-wide emission reductions by a particular year on a particular base year, and for China, it's a different differentiated actions that would not a absolute emission reduction, but in a way that would have in relative terms. And
pledges by 24 nations now total $10.14 billion.
We breached the $10 billion equivalent in terms of pledged amounts. So if we look at the amounts that were pledged for the fund since the start of this resource mobilization exercise 5 months ago, we stand at $10.14 billion equivalent. This means that the fund has basically turned the page.
Australian Foreign Minister Julie Bishop said the funds will help mobilize private sector investments with a focus on the Indian Ocean and Pacific regions on investment infrastructure, energy, forestry, and emissions reductions. Mr. Ban welcomed pledges by developed nations to the new Green Climate Fund due to help developing nations cut emissions and adapt to climate changes that will put pressure on food and water supplies. The Lima talks are trying to work out a draft element of a deal for Paris next year, but faced numerous fault lines about what should be included. Many developing nations want a target of cutting world greenhouse gas emissions to a net zero by 2050. OPEC nations, worried about loss of income from a shift to renewable energy, favor much vaguer long-term goals. But Mr. Barnes said there was still a chance of limiting global warming to an internationally agreed ceiling of 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times to limit more floods, drought, desertification, and rising sea levels.
We must act now. There is still a chance to stay within the internationally agreed ceiling of less than 2 degrees Celsius at global temperature rise. But the window of opportunity is fast narrowing. All countries must be part of this solution. All of society must be engaged. This is not a time for tinkering, it's time for transformation.
He welcomed signs of action, such as more businesses favoring carbon markets and a day of marches in September that he said mobilizes hundreds of thousands of people in the streets from Manhattan to Mumbai to Melbourne. But a new report warns that the cost of adapting to climate change in developing nations is likely to be 2 to 3 times higher than previous estimates, even if planet warming emissions are cut enough to keep global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. The Adaptation Gap report said there was a chance that adaptation costs could climb as high as an annual $150 billion by 2025 to 2030 and $250 to $500 billion per year by 2050, compared with earlier estimates of $70 to $100 billion yearly by 2050.
The report is an initial estimate of the cost of adaptation, and one of the main conclusions is that the current estimates of $70 to $100 billion per year may be underestimated, and that by the years 2030, 2040, we may need 2 or 3 times the amount that has been estimated by the IPCC and the World Bank.
At the climate negotiations in Peru, many developed countries want to focus more on mitigation action to reduce emissions. They fear that including a global goal on adaptation in the New Deal, due to be agreed in Paris in a year's time, will lead to demands for firm targets for more adaptation funding. But developing nations insist adaptation should be put on an equal footing.
Climate change negotiations have been essentially focused so far on mitigation, but it is very important to take into consideration the adaptation factors, because everybody, again, regardless of the level of development, is being hit by climate change.
If no new efforts are made to cut greenhouse gas emissions and temperatures head towards 4 degrees Celsius, adaptation costs could hit double the worst-case figures by mid-century, the report warned. The 49 least developed countries and small island developing nations are likely to have far greater adaptation needs than other parts of the world, the report said. Without early efforts to adjust to more extreme weather and rising seas in these countries, the gap between what is happening and what needs to happen to protect people, assets and ecosystems, the adaptation report warns, will widen.
Poor people, unfortunately, are getting shafted as we speak, and they will have to continue to fend for themselves. The world is not coming to their rescue.
It's about time that we recognize the need to take action now on mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. There's so many things that needs to be finalized in this meeting.
The report also identified gaps in the technology and knowledge needed for countries to adapt to climate impact. Most technologies required in the short term, such as water conservation and more resilient crop varieties, already exist, but there are major barriers to people using them. That's our program for the week. Thank you for watching. I'm Ayola Kasim. If you would like to watch any part of this edition, you can visit our YouTube channels, youtube.com/channelsweb. And should you have any comment or question, our inbox file@channelstv.com is always available. Till next time, from all of us here, it's bye for now.